Struggling cowboy took in a beaten woman, then discovered she was the judge's forbidden wife. A bleeding woman collapsed in the mud at Jake Morgan's doorstep during a thunderstorm. But when he discovered she was a federal judge's wife, he realized saving her life might cost him everything. What happened next would shake the very foundations of justice in the Old West, and prove that sometimes doing what's right means breaking the law. The rain came down like God's own judgment that night, turning the hard-packed earth around Jake Morgan's cabin into a sea of mud and regret. Lightning split the sky over the broken fence posts and dying cattle, showing him what he already knew, that his ranch was failing, just like everything else he'd ever tried to hold on to. Jake sat at his rough wooden table, counting coins that wouldn't cover next month's feed, when he heard something that wasn't thunder. A sound like a wounded animal, low and desperate, coming from somewhere beyond his front door. He learned to ignore most sounds in the dark. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, a man could go crazy listening to every coyote howl and wind-blown branch. But this sound was different, human. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the warped floorboards. The sound came again, weaker this time, like something dying. Jake's hand found the old Colt hanging on its peg by the door. In 3 years of trying to make this land work, he'd never had to draw it on a person. Tonight felt different. The door creaked open, and rain slapped his face like a cold hand. Lightning showed him his yard, the barn with its sagging roof, the chicken coop where no chickens lived anymore. Then, in the mud near his porch steps, he saw her. A woman lay on her side, her dress, what was left of it, spread around her like dark wings. The fabric had been fine once. Jake could tell even through the rain and dirt. Deep blue silk, the kind worn by wives of successful men. Now it clung to her like a burial shroud. Jake stepped into the storm, his boots sinking into the mud. When lightning flashed again, he saw her face clearly for the first time. Young, maybe 25. Pretty, though swollen and bruised in ways that made his stomach turn. Her left eye was nearly shut, purple and black around the edges. Blood ran from her nose, mixing with the rain. But it was her throat that made Jake's hands clench into fists. Dark finger marks circled her neck like a necklace of violence. Someone had tried to strangle this woman. Someone had meant for her to die. She stirred when he knelt beside her, her good eye opening to focus on his face. Fear filled that eye, raw, animal terror that made Jake raise his hand slowly, the way he would approach a spooked horse. "Easy there," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm not going to hurt you." She tried to speak, but only a whisper of air came out. Her throat was too damaged for words. Jake could see her shivering, see how the cold rain was stealing what little life she had left. "I'm going to pick you up now," he told her. "Get you inside where it's warm." When he lifted her, she weighed almost nothing. Her head fell against his shoulder, and he could feel how her whole body shook, not just from cold, but from something deeper, fear that had settled into her bones and made a home there. Inside the cabin, Jake laid her on his bed, the only real piece of furniture he owned besides the table and 2 chairs. The room smelled of old coffee and loneliness, but at least it was dry. He lit the oil lamp with shaking hands, casting yellow light over walls that needed paint and dreams that needed hope. In a lamplight, he could see her injuries clearly. The bruises were fresh, maybe a day old. Her fine dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing more bruises along her collarbone. Her hands were cut, as if she'd fought back against whoever did this to her. Jake had seen violence before. During the war, he'd watched good men die in ways that haunted his sleep. But there was something about violence against women that turned his blood cold. A special kind of cowardice that made him want to find whoever did this and make them pay. The woman's good, I followed him as he moved around a room, gathering what little he had to help her. A basin for water, clean rags that had once been shirt, a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for when the ranch finally died. When he approached the bed with the basin, she tried to push herself away from him. Her damaged throat made a sound like a broken bird trying to sing. "It's all right," Jake said, setting the basin on the floor and stepping back. I just want to clean those cuts. That's all. She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw her eyes move to the gun hanging by the door. Her whole body tensed, as if that old Colt represented every fear she carried. Jake followed her gaze and understood. Slowly, he walked to the door and took the gun down from its peg. Her breathing became quick and shallow, panic filling her face. But instead of coming toward her, Jake opened the door and threw the gun out into the rain. It landed in the mud with a wet thud, and he closed the door behind it. "There," he said, turning back to her. "No guns in here. Just a man trying to help." Something changed in her face then. Not trust, that would take time, but the possibility of trust. She let him clean her cuts without pulling away, though she watched his every movement like a deer ready to run. Jake worked in silence, washing the blood and dirt from her face and hands. The cuts weren't deep, but the bruises told a story he didn't want to read. Someone had done this with purpose, with the kind of anger that left permanent marks on more than just skin. When he was finished, he brought her a cup of water. She tried to drink, but her throat wouldn't let the water pass. She made a frustrated sound and touched her neck gingerly. "Take small sips," Jake suggested. "Just wet your mouth for now." She managed a few drops and looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. Then she touched her throat again and moved her lips, trying to speak. "My name is Jake," he told her, thinking that might be what she wanted to know. "Jake Morgan. This is my ranch. What's left of it, anyway." She shook her head and pointed to herself, then made the motion of speaking again. She was trying to tell him her name, but the words wouldn't come. "Don't worry about that now," Jake said. "Names can wait. Right now, you need rest." But she kept trying, growing frustrated when only whispers came out. Finally, she grabbed his hand and pressed it against her throat, letting him feel the damage there. Her skin was hot and swollen, the muscles beneath bruised and torn. Jake pulled his hand away gently. "Someone did this to you," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, and tears filled her good eye. Not tears of pain, but something deeper. Shame, maybe? Or the kind of hurt that goes all the way through a person and comes out the other side as numbness. "Are they looking for you?" Jake asked. The fear returned to her face immediately. She nodded again, more urgently this time, and tried to sit up. The movement made her dizzy, and she had to lie back down. "Then you'll stay here until you're strong enough to decide what comes next," Jake said. "No one's going to hurt you under my roof." She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language, as if kindness was something she'd forgotten existed in the world. Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the storm. The rain was starting to ease, but the clouds hung low and heavy, promising more weather to come. Somewhere out there, someone was looking for this woman, someone who had already tried to kill her once. He thought about his failing ranch, his empty bank account, the loneliness that had become his closest companion. Taking in a stranger, especially one who brought danger with her, wasn't the smart thing to do. It might be the thing that finally broke him completely. But when he turned back to look at her, lying small and broken in his bed, Jake knew he'd already made his choice. Some things mattered more than being smart. Some things mattered more than safety or success or any of the other things he'd been chasing since the war ended. Sometimes a man's character was measured not by what he gained, but by what he was willing to lose for someone else. The woman had closed her eyes, exhaustion finally claiming her. In sleep, the fear left her face, and Jake could see what she might look like when she wasn't running for her life. Beautiful, yes, but more than that. Strong, despite everything that had been done to her. The kind of strong that bent, but didn't break, even under the weight of violence. Jake pulled a blanket over her and turned down the lamp. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, its own choices. Tonight, he would stand guard over a broken woman in a broken house, and maybe that would be enough to start healing them both. Outside, the storm was passing, but Jake had the feeling that the real weather was still coming. The morning after the storm brought a quiet that settled over Jake's ranch like dust on old furniture. The woman slept for 18 hours straight, her breathing slow and careful, as if even in sleep she was afraid to take up too much space in the world. Jake worked his few remaining cattle with half his mind on the pasture and half on the cabin behind him. Every hour, he found himself looking back at the windows, checking for signs of life. When smoke finally rose from the chimney around noon, something tight in his chest loosened for the first time in months. By evening, she was sitting at his table when he came in from a barn. Her face was still a map of bruises, but the swelling around her had gone down enough that she could see clearly. She'd found his mirror somehow and tried to fix her hair, though it still fell in uneven waves around her shoulders. "I made coffee," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words came out rough and broken, like they had to climb over glass to reach the air. Jake nodded and hung his hat on the peg by the door, careful not to look at the empty space where his gun used to hang. "That's kind of you." She poured him a cup with shaking hands, and he pretended not to notice when some of it spilled onto the table. The coffee was stronger than he usually made it, and it tasted like the first good thing that had happened to him in longer than he could remember. "I'm Sarah," she said after they'd sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Jake looked at her over his cup. Something in the way she said it made him think it might not be her real name, but names were like everything else. Sometimes a person had to start over with new ones. "Sarah," he repeated, tasting the word. "That's a good name." She almost smiled then, just a small lifting at the corners of her mouth before she caught herself. "I want to thank you for what you did, bringing me in from the rain. You could have what? Left you to die." Jake shook his head. That wouldn't have been much of a choice at all. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Jake would wake before dawn and tend to his animals while Sarah moved quietly around the cabin, doing things he hadn't even realized needed doing. She swept the floors, washed his few dishes, mended tears in his shirts that he'd been meaning to fix for months. She never asked why his ranch was failing or where his family was or how a man ended up living alone in the middle of nowhere with more debt than cattle. She just accepted him the way he was, broken edges and all, and somehow that made him feel more whole than he'd felt in years. On the fourth day, she tried to cook dinner with the little bit of bacon and beans he had left. Her throat was healing enough that she could swallow small bites, though she still winced when she drank water too quickly. Jake watched her work at the stove, humming a tune he didn't recognize, and realized he was memorizing the sound of it. "You don't have to do all this," he said. "The cooking and cleaning. You should be resting." Sarah turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, there was something other than fear in her eyes. "I need to feel useful," she said. "Like I have a reason to be here." "You don't need a reason," Jake told her. "Sometimes a person just needs a safe place to exist for a while." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to figure out what kind of man would say such a thing and mean it. "Where I come from," she said slowly, "women always need a reason. We're useful or we're discarded." The way she said discarded made Jake's hands tighten around his coffee cup. He thought about the bruises on her throat, the fear in her eyes when she'd first seen his gun. "Well," he said carefully, "this isn't where you come from." That night, Sarah told him about her dreams. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, the cabin warm and peaceful around them. She'd been quiet for so long that Jake thought she might have fallen asleep in her chair. "I dream about running," she said suddenly. "Always running, but my legs won't work right. And there are voices behind me, getting closer." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I wake up and forget for just a second where I am. Then I remember I'm safe, and it's the strangest feeling. Strange how I've forgotten what safe felt like." She looked at him across the firelight. "I don't think I've felt safe since I was a little girl." Jake wanted to ask her about the life she'd run from, about who had hurt her so badly that safety felt foreign. But he'd learned that some stories had to be told in their own time, like wild horses that couldn't be rushed or broken. Instead, he told her about his own dreams. How he dreamed about the war sometimes, about friends who didn't make it home. How he dreamed about this ranch when it was new and full of promise, before the drought killed his crops and debt ate up his hope. "Maybe that's what broken people do," Sarah said. "We dream about the things we've lost." "Or maybe," Jake replied, "we dream about them so we don't forget they were real." By the end of the first week, Jake found himself hurrying through his morning chores so he could get back to the cabin. Sarah would have coffee ready, and they would sit together at the table while the sun climbed over the hills. She told him small things, how she used to have a garden, how she missed the sound of rain on a tin roof, how she'd always wanted to see the ocean. He told her about his plans for the ranch, the ones he'd mostly given up on, how he'd wanted to build a proper house someday, maybe raise horses instead of cattle, how he'd thought about just walking away from it all, but couldn't seem to make his feet carry him off the land. "It's beautiful here," Sarah said one morning, looking out at the hills that rolled away from the cabin like waves on a golden sea. "Peaceful." "It is now," Jake agreed, though he wasn't sure if he meant the land or the cabin or just having someone to share the quiet with. Sarah had been with him for 10 days when the riders appeared on the horizon. Jake spotted them first, 3 dark figures moving across the grassland like storm clouds made flesh. He was fixing a broken fence post when he saw them, still maybe a mile away, but coming steady. He dropped his tools and ran for the cabin. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line he'd strung between 2 posts, humming that same tune she hummed while cooking. When she saw his face, the humming stopped. "What is it?" she asked. "Riders coming," Jake said. 3 of them. The wet sheet slipped from Sarah's hands and fell into the dirt. Her face went white as winter, and she backed toward the cabin door like she was trying to disappear into the walls. "Sarah," Jake said gently, but she was already shaking her head. "They found me," she whispered. "I knew they would, but I hoped. I thought maybe I had more time." "Who found you? Who are they?" But Sarah was already moving, gathering up the wet laundry with quick, desperate motions. "I have to go," she said. "I have to run before they get here. If they find me with you." She stopped, looking at Jake with eyes full of terror and something else. Grief, maybe. The grief of someone who had found something precious just in time to lose it. "Sarah," Jake said again, stepping closer. "Tell me who's coming." The riders were closer now, close enough that Jake could see they wore dark coats and rode like men with authority, like men who were used to people getting out of their way. "Promise me something," Sarah said, and her damaged voice made the words sound like a prayer. "When they ask about me, tell them you never saw me. Tell them I was never here. I'm not going to lie for someone I don't understand," Jake said, "but I'm not going to hand you over to people who hurt you either." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and Jake saw her make some kind of decision. "My real name isn't Sarah," she said, "and the men coming for me, they have the law on their side." The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer, drumming against the hard ground like a countdown to something inevitable. Jake looked from Sarah to the approaching riders and back again, understanding finally that the quiet days of healing were over. Whatever was coming next would test more than just his courage. It would test everything he believed about right and wrong, law and justice, and what a man owed to the people he'd learned to care about. The 3 riders came up to Jake's cabin like judgment itself, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the still air like a question waiting to be answered. The man in the center rode a black stallion that cost more than Jake's entire ranch, and he sat in the saddle with the kind of straight-backed authority that came from never being told no. Judge William Harrison was a big man with silver hair and cold gray eyes that missed nothing. His black coat was tailored perfectly, his boots polished to a shine that caught the afternoon sun. Everything about him spoke of power and money and the kind of respect that came from fear rather than. Jake stepped out onto his porch, his hands loose at his sides. Behind him, he could feel Sarah, Elizabeth, pressed against the cabin door like a bird trying to become invisible against the bark of a tree. "Afternoon," Jake said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Mr. Morgan," the judge said, his voice carrying the kind of deep authority that filled courtrooms and made juries lean forward. "I am Judge William Harrison. I believe you have something that belongs to me." The 2 men flanking the judge looked like they'd been hired for their skill with guns rather than their conversation. One was tall and lean with dead eyes, the other built like a bull with hands that rested easy on his pistol grips. Neither of them looked like they'd lose much sleep over shooting a man who got in their way. "I'm not sure what you mean," Jake said. Judge Harrison's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. My wife, Mr. Morgan. Elizabeth Harrison. She's been missing for nearly 2 weeks now, and I have reason to believe she might have found her way to your establishment. The way he said establishment made it sound like something shameful, like Jake was running a brothel instead of trying to scratch out a living on a piece of hard land. I haven't seen any Elizabeth Harrison, Jake said, which was technically true. The woman behind his door had called herself Sarah. Of course not, the judge said, dismounting from his stallion with practiced ease. You've seen Sarah, haven't you? That's what she's been calling herself, I imagine. She always was fond of that name. Jake felt Sarah's sharp intake of breath through the door behind him. The judge's smile widened, hearing it too. Elizabeth, he called out, his voice carrying the tone a man might use to call a dog. Come out here, dear. You've caused quite enough trouble. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Jake heard the soft sound of footsteps, and Sarah, Elizabeth, stepped out onto the porch beside him. She kept her eyes down, but Jake could see the way her whole body trembled. Hello, William, she said, her damaged voice barely audible. There's my beautiful wife, the judge said, and his voice was warm now, almost loving. But his eyes stayed cold as winter stone. Look at you, darling. What happened to your face? Elizabeth's hand went unconsciously to her bruised cheek. I fell, she whispered. Yes, you've always been clumsy, the judge said. Falling downstairs, walking into doors. It's a wonder you can take care of yourself at all. Jake's hands slowly curled into fists. The judge was talking about Elizabeth's injuries like they were accidents, but every word was a threat wrapped in false concern. She's hurt, Jake said. Her throat's been damaged. She needs time to heal. Judge Harrison turned his attention to Jake, and those gray eyes studied him like a scientist examining a bug. Mr. Morgan, I appreciate your hospitality toward my wife, but Elizabeth belongs at home, where she can receive proper medical attention. Proper medical attention? Jake looked at the bruises on Elizabeth's throat, the fading black eye, the way she flinched every time the judge spoke. Looks to me like she got hurt at home. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The two gunmen shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. But the judge just smiled that cold smile. Mr. Morgan, I think you misunderstand the situation here. Elizabeth is my wife, legally married under the laws of this territory and the eyes of God. What happens between a husband and wife in the privacy of their own home is not the concern of strangers. It is when she shows up beaten near to death in my yard. Beaten. The judge's voice carried shocked surprise, as if the idea was unthinkable. Elizabeth, did you tell this man someone beat you? Elizabeth's eyes darted between Jake and her husband like a trapped animal looking for escape. I told him I fell down the stairs. Like always. Like always, the judge repeated, and now his voice was gentle, patient. You see, Mr. Morgan, my wife suffers from a nervous condition. She's prone to episodes. Sometimes she hurts herself. Sometimes she runs away. It's very sad, really. Jake stared at the judge, understanding finally what he was dealing with. This wasn't just a violent husband. This was a man who used his position and reputation to make his crimes invisible. Who could explain away any injury, any disappearance, with medical terms and legal authority? That's a lie, Jake said. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. One of the gunmen actually reached for his pistol before the judge held up a restraining hand. Careful, Mr. Morgan, the judge said, his voice still pleasant but with steel underneath. Calling a federal judge a liar is a serious accusation. The kind that could see a man charged with contempt, or disturbing the peace, or any number of other offenses. So is trying to murder your wife. This time, both gunmen drew their weapons, but the judge waved them back. Elizabeth, he said, never taking his eyes off Jake, tell this man the truth. Tell him how you hurt yourself and ran away because of your nervous condition. Elizabeth stood frozen between them, her eyes wide with terror. Jake could see her struggling, wanting to speak the truth, but terrified of what would happen if she did. It's all right, Jake told her quietly. Whatever you say, it's all right. No, the judge said, his voice sharp now. "It's not all right. Elizabeth, you will tell this man the truth, or I'll have him arrested for kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. You'll watch him hang for the crime of trying to help you." The threat hit its mark. Elizabeth's face went white, and she looked at Jake with eyes full of apology and despair. "I fell down the stairs," she said, the words coming out like they were being torn from her throat. "I have a nervous condition. I ran away because I was confused. William is a good husband. He takes care of me." Each word was a knife, but Jake understood. The judge wasn't just threatening him. He was threatening to destroy Jake for the crime of showing kindness to a woman who'd been beaten nearly to death. "There," the judge said, satisfaction in his voice. "Now, Elizabeth, get your things. We're going home." Elizabeth moved toward the cabin like a woman walking to her own execution. Jake watched her go, his mind racing through possibilities. He could fight. 3 against 1 with him unarmed wasn't good odds, but he'd faced worse during the war. He could try to reason with the judge, though he doubted a man who beat his wife would listen to logic. Or he could let her go back to the man who would probably kill her eventually and live with that knowledge for the rest of his days. "Judge Harrison," Jake said as Elizabeth reached the cabin door. The judge turned back to him, eyebrows raised in polite inquiry. "I want you to know something," Jake said. "I know what you are, and if Elizabeth shows up here again, beaten or dead, I'll make sure everyone else knows too." The judge's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, showing the violence beneath. "Mr. Morgan, you're a poor rancher with debts you can't pay and no influence in this territory. I'm a federal judge with friends in every courthouse and sheriff's office for 500 miles. If you ever make trouble for me, I'll destroy you so completely that no one will even remember you existed." "Maybe," Jake said, "but you'll still be a man who beats women. And that's something that doesn't wash off, no matter how much power you have." The judge stared at him for a long moment, then nodded to his men. "Get Mrs. Harrison's belongings," he ordered. Elizabeth came back out carrying the small bundle of clothes Jake had given her. She wouldn't meet his eyes, but as she passed him, she whispered something so quietly only he could hear. "Thank you for the 10 days. Then she was being helped onto one of the horses, sitting behind the lean gunman like a prisoner being taken to jail. The judge mounted his black stallion and gathered the reins. "Mr. Morgan," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I trust this is the end of our business together." Jake watched them ride away, Elizabeth small and defeated on the back of the horse, until they disappeared into the heat shimmer on the horizon. Then he stood on his porch for a long time, staring at the empty land and thinking about the choice he'd just made. He let her go back to the man who would hurt her again, probably worse this time. He'd chosen his own safety over her life, and the weight of that choice settled on his shoulders like a stone. But as the sun began to set over the hills, Jake made himself a promise. This wasn't over. The judge might have the law on his side, but sometimes the law and justice were two different things entirely. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch with the old rifle he'd retrieved from the mud, watching the horizon and thinking about choices. The gun was rusty and probably wouldn't fire true, but sometimes the appearance of being armed was enough to even odds that couldn't be evened any other way. 3 days had passed since the judge took Elizabeth home. 3 days of Jake staring at his empty cabin and listening to silence where her humming used to be. 3 days of knowing that somewhere 20 miles away, a woman who had found safety in his broken-down ranch was probably being punished for the crime of accepting kindness. The sound of hoofbeats came with the first light of dawn, just as Jake had expected it would. But this time it wasn't 3 riders, it was 4. The judge rode in front, as before, his 2 gunmen flanking him. Behind them, slumped over the saddle of a brown mare, was Elizabeth. Even from a distance, Jake could see she was hurt worse than before. Her dress was torn, her hair hanging loose and tangled. She sat the horse like someone who could barely stay upright, and when the morning breeze shifted, Jake could hear the soft sound of her crying. The judge dismounted with the same practiced ease as before, but this time his pleasant mask was gone. His gray eyes were cold as winter stones, and his mouth was set in a hard line that promised violence. "Mr. Morgan," he said, his voice carrying across the yard like a funeral bell. "I told you our business was finished." "Looks like you were wrong about that," Jake replied, standing slowly. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, but solid. "Real. You made some inquiries about me after I left," the judge continued. "Sent letters to people in town, asking questions about my wife's accidents. That was very unwise." Jake had indeed written letters to the doctor who had treated Elizabeth's previous injuries, to the sheriff who had investigated her disappearances, to anyone who might have seen what the judge really was. None of them had replied, which told him everything he needed to know about the judge's reach. "Someone needs to ask questions," Jake said. "Someone needs to care what happens to her. Someone needs to mind their own business," the judge replied. "But since you seem incapable of learning that lesson, I've brought my wife here to deliver it in person." He gestured to one of his men, who grabbed Elizabeth's arm and pulled her down from a horse. She stumbled and nearly fell, catching herself against the animal's flank. When she looked up at Jake, he could see fresh bruises on her face and something broken in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Tell him, Elizabeth," the judge commanded. "Tell Mr. Morgan what happens to people who interfere in other families' business." Elizabeth raised her head, and Jake saw her lips move, but no sound came out. The judge had damaged her throat again, maybe worse than before. "She can't speak," Jake said, fury building in his chest like a fire finding dry wood. "No," the judge agreed. "She talked too much anyway. Always whispering about wanting to leave, wanting help. This way is better." The casual cruelty of it hit Jake like a physical blow. The judge hadn't just beaten his wife again. He had deliberately destroyed her voice to keep her from asking for help ever again. "You're a monster," Jake said. "I'm a husband exercising his legal rights," the judge replied. "And you're a trespasser on those rights. Which is why this ends today." The judge nodded to his gunmen, and both drew their weapons. The lean one kept his pistol trained on Jake, while the bull-shouldered one pressed his gun against Elizabeth's temple. "Here's how this works," the judge said. "You're going to put down that rifle and walk into your cabin. Then you're going to write a letter confessing that you kidnapped my wife and held her against her will. After that, my men are going to shoot you for resisting arrest. And if I don't, then they shoot you anyway, but first they shoot her." The judge's smile was cold as a snake's. "Either way, you die. But if you cooperate, at least she lives long enough to regret the day she met you." Jake looked at Elizabeth, standing there with a gun to her head and defeat in her eyes. This was what he'd condemned her to when he let her go back. This was the price of his cowardice. "There's a third option," Jake said. "Oh, and what would that be?" Instead of answering, Jake dove to his left, rolling behind the water trough as the lean gunman's first shot kicked up dirt where he'd been standing. The rifle might be rusty, but Jake's aim was still true. His first shot took the lean man in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the dust. The bull-shouldered gunman swung his pistol away from Elizabeth's head, but before he could fire, something extraordinary happened. Elizabeth, who had been silent and broken just moments before, let out a scream that tore across the morning air like a battle cry. The sound was raw and damaged, coming from her ruined throat like the voice of every woman who had ever been beaten into silence. It startled the gunman just long enough for Jake to put a bullet through his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a howl of pain. The judge drew his own weapon, a silver-plated pistol that probably cost more than most men made in a year. But his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage at seeing his perfect plan falling apart. "You stupid, worthless woman," he screamed at Elizabeth. "I should have killed you years ago." He swung the pistol toward her, and Jake knew he would never get another shot off in time. The distance was too far, the angle too difficult. But Elizabeth was done being silent. She launched herself at her husband with the fury of someone who had finally found the strength to fight back. Her damaged voice rose again, not in a scream this time, but in words, broken, raspy words that carried the weight of years of suppressed anger. "No more," she shouted, her hands clawing at the judge's face. "No more falling downstairs. No more accidents. No more." The judge tried to shake her off, but Elizabeth held on like a woman drowning who had finally found something solid to grip. They struggled together, the silver pistol waving wildly in the air between them. Jake ran toward them, but he was still 20 feet away when the gun went off. For a moment, nobody moved. Elizabeth and the judge stood frozen in their struggle, both of them looking surprised. Then the judge staggered backward, looking down at the spreading red stain on his white shirt. "You shot me," he said, his voice filled with genuine amazement. "My own wife shot me." Elizabeth stood holding the silver pistol, her hand steady for the first time since Jake had known her. "I defended myself," she said, her ruined voice making the words sound like gravel and gold. "For the first time in my life, I defended myself." The judge fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the dirt. He was still breathing, but the fight had gone out of him along with his blood. The bull-shouldered gunman was trying to crawl away, clutching his wounded shoulder and moaning. Jake reached Elizabeth's side and gently took the pistol from her hands. "It's over," he said. "Is it?" Elizabeth looked down at her husband, who was making wet, gasping sounds in the dirt. "He's a federal judge. They'll hang me for this." "No," Jake said. "They won't." He walked to where the judge lay dying and knelt beside him. "Judge Harrison," he said loudly, making sure the wounded gunman could hear every word. "Do you have any last words about how your wife defended herself against your attack?" The judge's eyes focused on Jake with effort. "Go to hell," he wheezed. "I'll take that as a confession," Jake replied. He stood and looked at the wounded gunman. "You heard him confess to attacking his wife, didn't you?" The gunman, clutching his shoulder and clearly wanting no more part in this fight, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I heard plain." Jake helped Elizabeth into the cabin and gave her a cup of water, which she sipped carefully with her damaged throat. Outside, they could hear the judge's breathing getting weaker, and then it stopped altogether. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked. Jake looked at this woman who had found her voice at the moment when it mattered most, who had chosen to fight back after years of being beaten down. "Now we bury the dead and tell the truth," he said. "The real truth, not the lies he made you tell. Will anyone believe us? The gunman will testify that the judge attacked you and you defended yourself. As for the rest," Jake shrugged. "Sometimes the truth has to be enough, even when the world doesn't want to hear it." Elizabeth nodded and looked out the window at the morning sun climbing over the hills. "I can't go back to that house," she said. "I can't be Mrs. Harrison anymore." "Then don't," Jake said simply. "Be Sarah if you want. Be Elizabeth. Be whoever you choose to be." "And you?" she asked. "What will you choose to be?" Jake thought about his failing ranch, his empty bank account, the uncertain future that stretched ahead of them both. Then he looked at this woman who had found the courage to save herself, and he realized that some things were worth more than safety or success. "I'll be whatever you need me to be," he said. "A friend. A partner. A man who believes that everyone deserves a chance to start over." Elizabeth smiled, really smiled, for the first time since he'd known her. "I'd like that," she said in her broken voice that was somehow stronger than any voice he'd ever heard. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning mist and promising a hot day ahead. There would be questions to answer, stories to tell, and a future to build from the pieces of their broken pasts. But for now, it was enough that they were both alive, both free, and both ready to discover what justice looked like when it came from the heart instead of a courthouse. Sometimes the most important laws were the ones written not in books, but in the choices people made when everything else had been stripped away. In the end, that was what justice really was, one broken person choosing to stand up for another and finding the strength to fight back when fighting back seemed impossible. The rest, Jake thought as he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down beside the woman who had saved them both, was just details.